Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We are back with another episode of Daily Palantir, and on today's show, we are talking about one thing and one thing only, and that is the potential inclusion of Palantir into the S&P 500 index on this Friday. We've got a lot to discuss and analyze. Let's get into it. All right, so this Friday is going to be a very important day for two major reasons. Number one, from a macroeconomic perspective, and then number two, obviously, we get the index rebalance and inclusion of new companies into the S&P 500, which hopefully Palantir is on this list. In this video, we're going to talk about what I think the chances are of Palantir getting into that list, and also what are the qualifications for a company ultimately to get included. Now, from a macroeconomic perspective, we get the August jobs data on September 6th, 8:30 a.m. I'll be live at 8:20 a.m. for the market open. So if you are part of that market open stream or regularly watch those streams, I'll be live about 20 minutes earlier. And 8:30, that data is going to be very important. Either we add a decent amount of jobs and the market doesn't price in this massive recession. Obviously, you need people to have jobs so that they have money to spend on goods and services in order to avoid a recession. Or we add too little jobs and the market gets very worried and thinks we're headed into a recession, and then the rest of the year is going to be in a tough situation. Or we add way too many jobs and then the market starts wondering, well, is the Fed actually going to cut rates because is there a chance of inflation reaccelerating? So this is going to be a very tricky jobs report. Again, I'll be live on Friday trying to break down everything that's going on. But my expectation is about 150,000 jobs. If we get closer to 200,000, I don't think that's the worst thing either. Below 100,000 or below 120,000, that's when you start asking yourself, okay, are we really adding enough jobs in the United States of America to make sure that unemployment does not reach a level that makes it obvious that we're heading into a recession? So that report is going to be very important on Friday. And then after hours on the market close stream, I'll be live again. I think at 5:15, the S&P 500 officially releases the companies that got out of the index and that got into the index. And that's when we're going to see if Palantir got included. Okay, so let's go over what the S&P 500 even is and get a little bit of a recap for those that are confused by it or those that don't know why it's so important. So in general, the S&P 500 is a stock market index that tracks the performance of 500 of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States. I believe it has over $500 billion assets under management. It is one of the largest ETFs in the world. And essentially, if you buy the S&P 500, and I believe the S&P 500 went live around 1950, you've been able to buy the U.S. economy. You've been able to buy and track the U.S. market. The NASDAQ tracks tech. The Dow Jones kind of tracks blue chip stocks. IWM, the Russell 2000, tracks small cap companies. The S&P 500 says, hey, whether you're small, big, super big, you can be included in this index if you fit these core requirements and you are one of the 500 best companies in the United States. So Palantir being included into the S&P 500 is significant for a variety of reasons. A, the brand recognition that Palantir would get if it's included in the S&P 500, meaning it's one of the top 500 companies in the world. That's just something that's very important. Definitely, the top 500 companies in America, but America has some of the best and most important companies in the world. So that S&P 500 index is something that's bought up by the entire world, right? It's not just American companies, or American citizens. A lot of people buy the S&P 500 as just their gateway to accessing American prosperity and American innovation. So Palantir being included in the index would be very important. The brand recognition across the world would be significant. Fund managers, this is the second reason that it would be important, would have to buy Palantir. Fund managers have to keep a certain allocation based on the index and to the index for their fund. So if you're a fund manager managing, call it $100 million, and your philosophy, which this is very similar for a lot of fund managers that manage a significant amount of money, I've spoken to a decent amount of them, they would, for example, put 65% of their portfolio into the S&P 500, and the other 35% they would do in individual stocks. And that kind of gives their clients a little bit more assurance that, okay, this person is, taking care of the majority of my money, and then this other part of the money they're experimenting with. So when you say that you're going to buy the S&P 500, your whole idea is that you're going to keep the money safe. The whole point of Palantir being included into the index is that it's a stock that's not going to make the index super volatile. For example, GameStop, for a variety of reasons, but I think most importantly would not be included into the S&P 500 because it can go up or down 50% in a day. And the index doesn't want that. The index wants slow, reliable, sustained growth. They want something to have a long-term trajectory because that's what keeps people investing into the index. And that's what allows fund managers to be able to allocate capital into the index in an efficient way. So if you're a fund manager doing 65% S&P, 35% individual stocks, that just simply means that you have more exposure to the S&P 500, which means as a byproduct, you have exposure to Palantir. That's very important for Palantir because the more people that buy the S&P 500 ultimately are buying a small slice of Palantir. Additionally, if you have a particular type of hedge fund or money managing institution, you may have to allocate capital to Palantir to be within the requirements of your financial regulations, as you have certain goals to be able to match the performance and the allocation metrics of the S&P 500. So these are a bit more complicated, but essentially certain parts of the financial ecosystem need to match how the index matches their allocation capital. I think one good example is BlackRock. So the reason you see BlackRock and Vanguard own so many shares of these companies is because at the end of the day, they're allocating a lot of capital on behalf of different ETFs. And so it's not really bullish when BlackRock owns like 10 million shares of a company. It's like they kind of have to own those many shares. But the more the company becomes important and the more the company becomes part of a variety of different indices, Palantir really isn't part of that many indices at all. It's not in the NASDAQ. It's not in the IWM. Like, it's really not part of that many indices. And so as you become part of more indices, ultimately, a lot of the bigger institutions of the world have to buy your stock to match those allocations. And all of that, whether you're buying the S&P 500 and buying a slice of Palantir, or whether you're buying Palantir to match the allocation of the indice as a larger money institution, that means more buy-side pressure for Palantir. Now, ultimately, what does it take to get into the S&P 500? So there's a variety of requirements, but the point is Palantir matches all those requirements. So number one, you need to have a market cap of 14.5 billion. Palantir is at 70, so we're good to go there. Number two, you need to have a highly liquid stock, meaning there needs to be the ability for people to buy and sell easily and not have to worry about if they can get their order filled. So the stock should trade at least 250,000 shares in each of the 6 months leading up to the evaluation date. Palantir trades like 40 million shares a day, so that's not going to be an issue. Must be a U.S. company. That's not going to be an issue. In fact, Carp just got banned by Russia. I did a video on that yesterday. You can check it out, but that was kind of funny. Public float. At least 50% of the company shares must be available to the public. This is also true because 50% of the company is not held by insiders. Financial viability. This has been the most important one. The company must have positive earnings in the most recent quarter as well as the most recent 4 quarters. Palantir has now been profitable and will be profitable for 7 quarters in a row. GAAP profitability. This was the most important metric that we needed to get, and we started that journey in 2023. At the end of 2023, and now we are GAAP profitable for the past 6 quarters, which is very good for Palantir. And then the other things are, good financial reporting records, corporate structure, all that stuff, all the basic things that Palantir has. The core thing was GAAP profitability. Are you a profitable company? You cannot be included in the top 500 companies on the planet if you're not profitable. Palantir is profitable. And so as a result, Palantir is now eligible to be part of the S&P 500. Now, what companies have recently got into the S&P 500 and what companies recently got removed? So companies that got removed: Zion Bank, Regional Bank, Whirlpool, Robert Half, Illumina, some companies that got removed, some companies that got in: GoDaddy, KKR, Supermicro Computer, SMCI, Deckers, the shoe brand, and CrowdStrike. So when I think the committee is looking at some of the companies they put in, for example, SMCI and CrowdStrike, SMCI is down almost 60% since it got in. Why? Because at the end of the day, hardware company, important in AI, important in semiconductor space, growing rapidly, but their gross margins are disgusting. They failed to file a 10K report, or they delayed the filing of that. Just not a good look for the company. Therefore, the company has been very volatile, and the company stock has gone down. I think it was at 1,200 at one point. Now it's at like 400. So SMCI got into the S&P 500 index. I would argue Palantir is much more important than SMCI. But SMCI, for some reason, got into the index, and they haven't performed as well. Then you've got CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is a very, very important company. I think the outage that they had only signifies how important the company is going to be over the long term, given the entire world shut down when CrowdStrike shut down. It was a bad thing that happened, but it proved its importance to the broader market. But CrowdStrike got included, was at $400. Now it's at $278. And I kind of think CrowdStrike's going to waffle around this 250 to 280 range for a while until they really get their growth and momentum back. And I think that's okay because, they had a really bad outage and they're going to have to work to rebuild their trust, all that good stuff. But CrowdStrike and SMCI both got included into the index, and then both had things happen that sent their stocks down 30 to 40% that were independent of the broader market falling 10 or 20% like we saw back in August 5th when the market fell 10%. So from that perspective, the companies that have gotten into the index, the tech companies like SMCI and CrowdStrike, they have been more volatile than Palantir. And one could argue they have had negligence in terms of their operations, whereas Palantir hasn't. Palantir has just been doing its thing. So I think when the committee really sits down and they think, hey, do we want AI thematic companies Do we want companies that are actually operationalizing LLMs in a meaningful way? I don't know if the committee thinks of this stuff that deeply, but at the end of the day, if the committee is like, hey, do we want the 500 best companies in the world? And if we think AI is going to be a massive tailwind for investors because they're ultimately deciding what companies investors will have exposure to in the S&P 500 over the next decade, I think it's a no-brainer. I know I'm biased here, but like legitimately, I think it is an absolute no-brainer to say Palantir should be included in the index, given they've been profitable for 6 quarters and they've started to reaccelerate growth. So you can point out all the bad issues with Palantir if you want to point out, the valuation is too intense, blah, blah, blah. Like, you can do those things, but if we're looking at it based on just pure merits of the company and then the financial performance, I think it's obvious that Palantir should be included into the S&P 500. Now, the one reason I'm skeptical of Palantir getting included on Friday, and if they get included, I would be very happy, but this is the one reason I'm skeptical, is that their institutional holdings, meaning the number of institutional investors that ultimately own Palantir, is still low. It is higher than it was at the beginning of the year, but it's still low, and that's kind of the problem. So the institutional holdings for a company like Palantir, pulling it up right here, is about 45%. And or a little bit less than that, 44.15, which is good, but it's just not. So about 945 million shares long. It's not what the committee wants. The committee wants 60 to 80%. And if you look at CrowdStrike, it's like 80%. If you look at obviously SMCI, companies like that, they're closer to 70%. So Palantir, the large caps, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, those are all closer to 70, 80%. So Palantir being at 45% is good, but it's not great. And I think the committee wants to know that, hey, if we're accepting this company into the index, then we want the company to have such a strong institutional investor base that even if the company struggles to some perspective, that is not going to lead to the company ultimately going out of business. SMCI right there at about 60%, 35 million shares are long. That is not going to stop the company from going out of business. And I think that's fair. I think it's a little short-sighted to only use that as the metric, but Google right there, 87%, right? Like, at the end of the day, if a lot of institutional investors own your stock, it's going to be hard for them to dump your stock if you have a mistake, which is what stops the volatility of the S&P 500. Now, we saw this with CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike has 82% institutional ownership. They got dumped 40%. But the thing is, that was the extent of their pain, and now they're only down 20%, right? So they recovered a bit. And it's like institutional investors were willing to overlook mistakes, continue to buy up the stock, and just move forward, which is, I think, what the S&P 500 committee wants. If Palantir made some bad mistake in the stock, or they had a bad quarter and the stock fell, 10, 20, 30%, the question, I think, to the committee is, hey, is this a bunch of retail investors that are just in it for a little trade and they get out and they never buy it back again? Or are these institutional investors that are able to accept a bad quarter and still believe there is such a strong growth trajectory that they don't care about a bad quarter and buy it on that dip, which actually continues to balance out the index? I don't know. And I think the committee doesn't know either, which is what they're going to be afraid about if they allow Palantir to be included into the S&P 500. I think it's a reasonable concern. I think the company's merits outweigh the concern about institutional ownership, because if you want the 500 best companies in the world, I think it's obvious Palantir is one of the 500 best companies in the world, especially if you evaluate the nitty-gritty details of it. But that's what I do. I don't think the committee goes through the nitty-gritty details, so I don't know how they're going to come to the conclusion on if it's good or bad for Palantir to be in the S&P 500. Nonetheless, this Friday, we're going to find out. I'll be live starting at 3:45 on the market close on Friday. We'll go up all the way until 5:30. I'll try to get some guests with me to see 5:15. That's like the day we're refreshing the website. It crashes every time, to see if we got in. And if we get in, I think it's going to be great. One final thing I'll say is that Palantir holding 30 has been phenomenal for the past 3 weeks. And we're on the 4th week of Palantir now holding $30, like having that 3 handle. One of the reasons, a lot of people are asking me, like, look, we think Palantir is an amazing company, but the valuation is kind of ridiculous. Why is it holding this $30 range? One of the reasons could be because institutional investors are buying it up before they get into the S&P 500. We saw this happen many times. With Tesla, it rose up about 30, 40% before it got into the S&P 500. Then it got in, then it fell. So actually getting into the S&P 500 wasn't as big of a catalyst versus the run-up to get into it. So I don't know what will happen to the stock after we get in, if we do get in on Friday. But one of the reasons you could argue that it's up 40% in the past month is because investors are getting excited about the company and they're thinking that there's a chance it's going to get into the S&P 500, so they're propping it up, and that's why it's maintaining above that $30 range. If we don't get into the index, do I think it falls below 30? Not really. I think it falls below 30 in September and October just because of seasonal weakness. But that could be one of the reasons the stock has done so well, is people are anticipating this inclusion, and maybe we get in. Maybe this is the run-up before the inclusion, this staying above $30 range. Or maybe it's not. I guess we're going to see what happens. But it'll be very important. September 6th, I'll be live on Friday. And we'll figure out. If you can't make the live stream, my Twitter's in the description. You can follow me on Twitter. I will tweet it out as soon as I get the news on September 6th. But regardless if we get in or not, I do think that Palantir deserves to be in, and it's just a matter of time. So if we don't get in this time, okay. I think 2025, it's inevitable. At that point, we're going to be 10 quarters of gap profitability. Most likely, we're going to get in. And if we don't get in 2025, then it's probably going to be 2026. But at that point, I think the stock is going to be closer to that $40, $50 level if we continue to execute. So regardless, it's going to happen. It would be fun if it happens sooner than later. It's a big badge of honor for shareholders to say your company's part of the S&P 500. But it's just going to be a question of if the committee thinks that it's officially time to get us into the index. All right, that's it for me. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. I will see you guys Friday, and we'll see if Palantir can get into the S&P 500. Bye, everyone.